This video is your 2D notes dealing with archaeology. So before we get started, we had a little quick class discussion about the different types of ways that you can learn history. The most obvious would be books. You could also interview a witness. So those of you who have grandparents who are involved in things, you could go talk to them. Museums are great ways. The internet. Can't spell right now. History class was one that came up. Many other ways, the newspaper, magazines, artifacts. All of these are different ways that we can learn about history or what has happened in the past. Okay? Now we've got a couple terms for you. History is the study of recorded history. So when we talk about prehistory, we are actually talking about the period of time before we had written records. So the time period when we didn't have written records, obviously. So there was no writing, there was no way of recording it. Now the question is, how do we know what prehistoric humans were like if they weren't able to write down things about themselves or leave records for us like the Greeks and the Romans did? Well, we have these guys who go around and study prehistoric humans and their remains and what they leave behind for us, which isn't writing, but they leave artifacts behind, and these guys are called archaeologists. Archaeologists are scientists who study past cultures by locating and analyzing human remains, settlements, fossils, and artifacts. Easy way to think about that would be Indiana Jones. Now, Indiana Jones is a more fun archaeologist, but archaeologists do go around looking for artifacts, and then when they use those artifacts to make conclusions about how past people lived. So what kind of things can we find at archaeological dig sites? Human remains can tell us how people looked. It can tell us about nutrition, health, the quality of life that people at that settlement lived in or that time period. If you guys have ever seen the TV show Bones, there's a character on Bones, Angela, who's an artist, and what she does is once they've reassembled the skeleton, she takes a digital scan of it and estimates what that person looked like. In this day and age, all we need is a skeleton, and we can know what that person looked like in real life. Now, other fossils, not necessarily human remains, but animal remains, they'll tell us what animals lived in the same region as the humans. So what did they use as domesticated animals? What was their food? What type of game did they hunt? What were threats and predators? They can tell us about how life was just based on what is around. Tools and weapons can also tell us about the technology available within the settlement. Was it simple tools? Were they made of bone? Were they sharpened sticks? Had they figured out how to file stone down? Had they developed early metals? Pottery and jewelry will tell us about, again, materials that are available, and then technology and cultural evidence. So they'll tell us like what materials, types of things were readily available for them, not stuff that they had to dig underneath the ground like coal for us, but what types of things that they have that were easy to find, shells or beads or stuff like that. And then it also gives us some kind of cultural evidence, because usually people are going to tend to make jewelry or pottery out of something that's important to them. So like religion or things like that. Architecture that might be left behind will again tell us about culture. A lot of architecture was to honor gods and celebrate them in early times. It'll tell us what level of technology they had access to, and then what their mathematical abilities are. The Great Pyramids were built 5,000 years ago. They're perfect pyramids, perfect square bases. No offense to you guys, most of you guys don't have the geometric knowledge to do that without a calculator right now. They didn't exactly have calculators in the year 3000 BCE. And then texts and art. Again, texts and art, if they have them, it'll give us some history, idea of their religion, beliefs, some level of literacy that they might have had access to. We don't necessarily always have that, but when we do, those are the things that they can help us understand. Couple of key early examples of architecture from early humans. We have Stonehenge in England. The city of Aleppo in Syria, which unfortunately is pretty close to being totally destroyed because that's where the rebels have been hiding out, and Assad has bombed it to even further ruin than it was. And then the city of Jericho in Palestine are very, very, very early examples of early man architecture. And then art, the Catalhayek dig in Turkey is a good example of early art, as well as the Lascaux cave paintings in France, and any other cave paintings you can find. Now, we are actually able to figure out how old a fossil is, and this is through a process known as carbon dating. No, that is not what you do on your way to homecoming. Okay? Now, carbon dating, it's a scientific test that's used to analyze the age of fossils and artifacts. It only works on things that were once alive, and it only works back to about 45,000 years, maybe a little farther than that. And essentially the way it works, you'll go over this in your science classes later, is that everything that has a carbon molecule, usually a living life form, if you guys have ever heard the term, humans are a carbon-based life form. Every carbon molecule has a half-life, so its atomic weight halves over a set period of time, and you can measure the carbon in fossils to figure out how many half-lives it has had. So I'm just going off the top of my head. So if we have a half-life of 40 years, then every 40 years the mass of the molecule will have halved. So if we have a quarter of a molecule, we know that half of it went down to half in 40 years. Then it went from half to a quarter in 40 years. So 80 years old. And we can use that to measure things until all the carbon is finally gone. So carbon dating is a test that lets archaeologists and scientists know exactly how old something is.